When you have a low-frequency behavior, it is going to be hard to find patterns. This is why when the FBI and the Secret Service tried to figure out what are the patterns among the school shooters, it is such a low base rate event that finding patterns are extraordinarily difficult. So when we look at this, you may find, with additional information, you may find common situations or antecedents that are where it's going to be more likely. And in doing that, we may be able to start building some support. But that's where I would go. Now, did I ask you to put all of that in here? No. But this gives us the basis. If you can teach teachers to present cases like this, you're going to pop through an assessment pretty quickly. Now imagine that you have this case study, you've got it scrunched down just like this. You did a very nice job on this, and you also have a teacher who is able to think functionally about behavior and understands this antecedent behavior consequences piece. You're going to be able to move through this process pretty quickly. If they're still stuck in talking about a lot of other things, it's going to move very slowly, and it's going to mean that what might have been a 20-minute or 30-minute meeting now becomes an hour, a 90-minute, 2-hour, sometimes quasi-therapy session. So that's something to think about. Linda?
Is it also by who's with her, and that they're who a recorder would be that makes it also difficult?
Explain. I'm not sure I understand exactly what you're asking.
All right, well, I'm going to put it in the context
Sure.
of our program, that we oftentimes hear that the interpreters are busy interpreting and don't really have a lot of time to be recording behaviors or to do behavioral interventions because they're doing a different job at that time. So I was wondering if that also makes this a little bit better.
If, from an intervention point of view, if your interpreter is busy interpreting, it's going to be very hard for them to be doing a lot of other kind of interventions. Now, that does not mean they can't be intervening. For example, whatever job that you're in working with somebody, whether it's an interpreter or a coworker, if you are sullen, aggressive, nasty, it's going to be a bad thing. And you might discover that, I mean, is it possible that the interpreter is having a bad day on each of these 6 events? It's the same interpreter having a bad day, and they're being negative and unfriendly? Possibly. In building a behavior support plan, you always have to make sure, and we'll come back to this, you always have to make sure that the interveners or the interventionists can actually do the things that we're building into the support plan, because if they can't, it's irrelevant. And if an interpreter says, I can't do that and meet the requirements of my interpreting job, then we need to look elsewhere for that. That's a good point.
I want to know if the same one-on-one interpreter was there on all 6 occasions, if their attention was diverted just because of the language levels, if they're saying language is a problem and she's not getting attention for whatever she's trying to convey, because a different person doesn't read her right.
Absolutely. So we know from the earlier studies with cognitive impairments that the inability to communicate, for whatever the cause of that is a source of frustration, a source of problem behavior. So, looking at that, is it possible that the interpreter wasn't available to help communicate in those conditions? And maybe always a possibility. What we're really doing, though, is by doing this case study, we've set up the situation in which you and I can have a very quick conversation and get right to the critical questions. Yes?
The thing I see a lot is they put down the antecedent impulse, and I say we need describable behavior, and that impulse is measurable. Let's put unknown until we decide for sure what that may be, because I think a lot of people don't know it's okay to put unknown until that's determined in the process.
Yeah, that's a good point, and we're going to talk about that today with talking about narrative recordings and ABC recordings. Is we're going to talk about this piece about what does it mean to describe the antecedents. And that is a different way of thinking about it. And people will say, you really want me to go into everything that happened before? I said, give me the 15 seconds that happened right before the behavior. If that doesn't help me, now let's back up to the full minute before the behavior. Let's back up to, and we can move backwards. It's pretty easy in some cases to look at the 15 seconds right before, because they'll say, well, in all of these cases, the teacher asked the student or directed the student to do something. Ah, I see a pattern. Or it can be that we back up and we say, in the 5 minutes preceding this, and in the 5 minutes preceding each of the other events, there was low-level bullying or harassment by peers, in which that really tells me something. But it also gets into the discussion of what's the task, what's the physical setting, the classroom, the lunchroom, the whatever, and what's the social setting? Who are the people that are around? Because what you may find is it's not the physical setting and it's not the task. I don't like Dale. I don't like being around him. I don't want to have anything to do with him. And when Dale's around, I go off. Closer the proximity, more likely the problem behavior. So when we set up this piece, though, what you're getting at is you very quickly know the critical elements, and we can immediately move into asking the questions. Let's give Jill another round of applause. Thank you very much, Jill. Who would like to go next with a case presentation? We'll put them up here. Whoops. Put them up here for people to see. We've got who's volunteering? I'm just hearing. Okay, come on up. Okay.
I ramble a lot, so you're going to have to...
So we already know. Did you? She cued me. I love this. She said I ramble a lot. So I'm going to just say you're going to stay real focused on this one, right?
Okay, yeah.
We're pre-correcting here. We're going to stay really focused. Do you want to run this or you want me to?
I can hold it.
So just pull down here.
Oh, okay. Okay, this is Angela. She is... Should I hold this?
Absolutely. Can you hold all that stuff all at once?
Okay, this is Angela. She is 21 and resides at a residential facility called Happy Hills. She sees her parents about once a month. She's in a public school that serves students in the moderate to severe range of mental impairment, and the school uses total communication. And, oops. She was diagnosed with severe mental retardation, and she also has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. She's on no meds, could use glasses and hearing aids, but won't tolerate wearing them. And she is very compassionate. She worries when students are upset. She's a sweet child, can sort items, learns best in environments that she can be doing things, so like moving around. She has trouble expressing her needs and does very poorly in unstructured times. And she doesn't do well in hallways when there's a lot of things going on. A big problem that we're having is that she likes to get into other people's property. So in the classroom, she'll go into my purse, or she'll go into my pockets or into the cabinets. So that's the issue that we're having, is that we can't get her to keep to herself, I guess you could put it. And limited, okay, so yeah. So basically when she isn't in a structured activity, that's when she gets into these things where she's going into people's pockets. And so our problem is that I do my best to structure every single second of her day, but there is times when it's not going to be structured. And the other part is that we're hoping to get her into a residential facility for adult placement, and in those facilities, it's not always structured. So we're really trying to teach her boundaries and what's hers and what's not hers. So I think that's it.
All right. Actually, stay here with me for just a second. So, what did you hear Marcy?
Marcy.
If Marcy were presenting this case to you as the student's teacher and you were the consultant, what are the most basic elements that you want to hear? Let's back up here just a little bit.
We want to make sure we know exactly what behavior she's talking about. She's identified the behavior.
Okay, so we want to know the behavior. What do we want to know about Marcy? You've got some pieces here. I would probably say, Angela, is that right? Mm-hmm. Angela is 21 years old, living in a residential facility. Parents visit her regularly. English is spoken. She communicates through sign language, gestures, and behaviors. Pardon? Probably not at this point. And here's why. At this point, I want you to get just the basics in a case presentation. And one of the things you did, Marcy, is you actually were already moving ahead into thinking functionally about this behavior. And so you gave a lot of really great information. I want people to sort of separate out two things. One is the piece of just presenting the case from trying to solve the problem. And one of the hardest things to do, if you've done these interviews, and you're going to be doing them today, is to keep people from jumping to an intervention. To just get the information first. So if we have that basic piece down, actually one of the things that might be interesting is could use hearing aids and glasses but won't wear them. But then it gets into the behavior. And I would probably have a little bit more description about what the behavior is that you see, but just bring it all down into just a couple of lines. So she crosses boundaries, gets into other people's things, etc. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're going to take a question that I'm going to come back to. I want you to be thinking just off the top of your head, and this is somebody you know, right? Oh, yeah. I want you to think, if you had it to do again, could you take it down into just a few sentences? If you were to cut this all down, actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you sit down, which you're thinking, that's what I really was looking for anyway. That meets your escape-motivated behavior, right? What I'm going to do is I want you to think about this. I want you to cut it down into just a few sentences to describe the case. If you could come to me with just one slide with a few bullet points. We're going to come back after you've had some time with your team. You don't need to do it while somebody else is doing their presentations. We'll give you some time to work on it. But I want you to come back with, if you had just 4 or 5 bullet points, what would those bullet points be to try to communicate the case to somebody working with you? Let's give Marcy a hand. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I was going to say that teachers and school staff are in a difficult position because they've been trained to educate. When it comes to a question of medication, they're not trained in medication, but yet they see regular medication. They get ideas about medication from their experiences with that medication. Mm-hmm. And so they start taking on the ability to use the language about medication, which they're not really trained to do yet. And then we go to hearing aids again. Refusing to wear hearing aids leads to the question for people in this room, are they effective? Is there a reason for them to wear them? Which again is not an area that teachers are trained in because that's the audiology. So many things come into play.
Yes.
It's very difficult.
Yes, and that's all the more reason why we need to distill it down to the very basics. A description of the student, a description, a little bit of the setting that they're in and the tasks that they're engaged in, that sort of broader context, and then really specific. What's the behavior? When does it occur? Some of those kinds of things. Don't try to get into solving the problem quite yet, but I think it's important to recognize many of your kiddos, yes, you have to, you get lost in it. And I'll tell you, probably the hardest piece in this is getting overwhelmed with information. So let me walk through this. As I look at this, Let me walk through this with you. Resided at Happy Hills Residential Facility since 1999. I would drop the since 1999. I reside at Happy Hills, a residential facility. My parents and siblings visit me once a month. Now, you've written this in the first person, and I like that from the perspective of making this personal. But I also want to separate out, and this is not meant, I don't know if she shared this or you just set it up this way in the first person. Not wanting to diss the person who's speaking here, but we want to take this to the very basics. If you can't make a direct connection to the behavior of concern, leave it out. English is spoken in my home. Direct connection, I don't know. If you can make the direct connection, leave it in. If not, take it out. I communicate my needs through sign language, gestures, and behavior. Marcy, tell me if I'm correct. Did you say, and maybe it's on a later slide, she communicates but isn't always able to really communicate what she needs? That's critical. I might say, I communicate through sign language, gestures, and behavior, but I'm not always able to fully indicate what I need or want. Okay? I'm enrolled in a public school serving students functioning in the moderate to severe range of mental impairment. Does she have mental impairment, cognitive impairment?
Yeah, that's on the next slide.
Okay, then I would put that piece in. Do you see that this is a critical factor in her behavior? Okay, and the reason I ask that is if, for example, and I'll give you some ranges of what I've seen, if, for example, you have a student whose behavior is probably fairly squared away. That's a hard one to, sorry. I was doing this the other night with a Spanish interpreter, and I started using some phrases, and I went, okay, I can't do that one. If the behavior is fairly appropriate, but you think that the setting is a setting where there is a lot of inappropriate behavior being modeled, for example, it's one of the reasons why we try to depopulate the state hospital with the folks who don't need to be there and the small facilities, smaller homes and things, because they're getting lots of role modeling of inappropriate behavior. If that's a connection you can make, if you think that this is a relevant piece of it, leave it in.
Oh, you mean that she attends the school, not her own mental?
Both. Both. So when I'm thinking about this, if I'm talking about the student having cognitive impairments, that's important to know, because that helps me understand what level of cognitive functioning they're at. But if the public school setting, if you don't see the real impact there, leave it out. Now, for example, the other side of that is, if she has been mainstreamed into a setting where she is out of place, has little support, kids don't pay attention to her, all of those kind of things, then the setting again matters. But if you can't make a connection to the setting, drop it. Okay? I mean, you might say, I'm 21 years old and go to public high school. My school incorporates total communication throughout the day. Is it important? I don't know. Diagnosis. Okay, here's the piece about cognitive impairment. This one's an interesting one. I also have attention, ADHD, right? Does that help? I don't know. Because actually what we've just done is probably describe the behavior more. It's become circular at some point. They're inattentive and off task because they have ADHD. If they have ADHD, we know that because they're inattentive and off task. Does that help me? Do I do something different for a student who has inattentive behavior than a student who has ADHD? No. So some of this, we get into this diagnostic stuff. Remember last time we talked about the importance of knowing the different sources of the labels? Medical folks use different labels than educational folks. And medical folks are usually in the business of having diagnosis, treatment, and that's not usually the case with us. We usually have description of behaviors and we work up an intervention. It's a little bit different. Medication, does it matter? If we've seen changes based on the medication, it may matter. Again, try to narrow this down to a very quick, succinct kind of presentation of the case where we can follow up with then the pieces of the thinking function. Now, you may put into a case, here's where it happens, here's the behavior, here's what happens afterwards. If you do that, which is our goal for our teachers, when you sit down and do this with teachers, you're modeling for them. If you always put it in an antecedent behavior consequence format, the teachers, and this goes back to comments you made about little bits of learning over time. So let me give you an example of this. When I had a district I was working with that I knew they did not respond historically, did not respond well to change. They thought they were doing everything just fine. What we did to initiate the change was to have a discussion in April, informal discussion. In June, right after the school year ended, we talked about what was going to happen in September. And they had all summer to stew on it and let it die. Let it sort of fade out of memory. We came back in September and started reintroducing it, and over the course of this year, we're just having discussions. The same thing is true with the teachers. If you want them to be able to present cases like this, one of the things you can do is present for them and always put it in that same structure. If you always go back to, here's a little description of the student, here's a little description of their setting, so they go to a public high school, or they go to a private school, or whatever it is, and then you can give a little bit of antecedent behavior and consequence, you've actually given them a model for presenting cases. And if you do it over and over, you'll find that they start using the same language. Now, with teaching, one of the things that I love is, because we are verbal, is we can tell them why we're telling them. So what I would say is, I know there's a lot of stuff about, family history, but I'm not really sure that that's directly relevant here. What we're going to focus on is the conditions under which this behavior happens. The antecedents to this behavior, what happens right before, is this, this, and this. The behavior is, and I'm going to give very specific behavior, and what happens right after that is, and I say that. Now what I've just done is modeled for them how to present to you and how to think about it. Because if you can get them to present this way, what you're also going to get is for them to think about interventions in that structure. If they're presenting about, parental conflict and, jealousies at home and all those kind of things, it's going to be very hard to narrow their thinking down into a specific, smaller, more focused intervention. Questions or thoughts about that? Okay. Another case study. Nathan. All right. You know what we're going to do? We're going to change this up a little bit. You've had an opportunity to see a couple of people do this. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. In your team right now, if you presented a case study, if you've got a case study or have presented one already or you haven't done one, now crunch a case down into so you can present this. So Terry, what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you go through on your handout and crunch it down into the very basics that you need. And we're going to give you a few minutes to work on this and come back. So I'm going to give you about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we're going to have a couple more case study presentations. I want you to work with teams. If you're not here with a team, get with a team and help them walk through their case study. Okay? So we're going to sort of crunch it down a little bit. If you need help, just raise your hand. I'll be there.